everyone, welcome back to the Worship Cellist. I'm David Feldman, and today we're tackling a really common question as I introduce this concept of playing a middle voice to students and the concept of hand orientations as well. And the question is, how do I make my cello lines more interesting? So I've mastered changing notes with different chord progressions. I've mastered note options and changing between them. I feel comfortable, but I'd like to make my cello lines a little more expressive. Because when you play only the notes in a dot diagram, it can add a nice texture to the sound of a worship team, but it can be a little dull in terms of movement. There's not a lot of note changes or things that draw interest to the listener's ear. So there are plenty of ways to do this. We're going to focus on a couple different ways to do this. In this video specifically, we're going to focus on adding non-chord tones. We're going to have a couple videos after this one. The next video is going to be about playing melodic ostinatos, and the video after that is going to be about utilizing hand orientations on adjacent strings to increase your note choices. But in this video, we're going to focus on non-chord tones. So when you're playing a middle voice strictly from the dot diagrams, as we've discussed before, you're only playing notes within each chord. We call those chord tones. We're going to keep this framework in mind as we introduce non-chord tones, but we're going to think of the dot diagrams not as the only notes we're going to play, but more as landing points in between chord changes. So to make the cello line more engaging, you can play other notes from the hand orientation between these landing points and create small moments of improvisation. Now, this is a great step for a beginner because it doesn't require lengthy improvisation. It just requires improvisation as I get from this note to my other landing note. And I can improvise very slightly between those, just using the notes in my hand orientation. So my note choices are very limited, and my movement is very limited. So as I'm adding non-chord tones, there are a few patterns that are simple and straightforward that are great to start with. These are formal names we would study in music theory, things like passing tones, neighbor tones, escape tones, appoggiaturas. And let me just briefly explain when you would use each one. So let's say you're playing a chord chart and your dot diagram moves from a low note to a high note from one chord to another. Let's say I'm in mi orientation. So my note, let's say I'm in the key of D. So my note choices look like this. And let's say I'm going from a low note to a high note. Well, because of that, there's a space in between those two notes where another note lives, and I can use that note as what we call a passing tone between the low and the high note. So I can use my middle note, or if I'm descending, right? Simple way to add a little bit of interest to your line. Let's say the dot diagram stays on the same note from one chord to another. You could play what we call a neighbor tone. So if my note choice stays on the low note, I could play just an upper neighbor to it. If I'm staying on the middle voice, I could play a lower neighbor or an upper neighbor. And then let's say the dot diagram moves us from a low note to a middle note or a high note to a middle note. So we're moving by step. We can introduce the third note as an appoggiatura or an escape tone. Let's say we're moving from a first finger to a second finger or a low to a middle note. There I added the upper note in between, or right? These are just some simple patterns you can use. Of course, you could add more non-chord tones. You could create a more elaborate pattern, but these are great ones to begin with. So to demonstrate these techniques, I'm going to use the chorus and the turn of Almighty God, written by Waymaker Worship. I'm going to demonstrate a few different patterns, including passing tones and notes that move above and below the main dot diagram notes. And I'm going to include the dot diagrams on the side so you can see which notes are from the diagram and which ones I'm adding as non-chord tones. So I hope you enjoy. with non-chord tones, I'm going to put a link in the description below so you can learn a little bit more about these names and these types of non-chord tones. And since there are no strict rules for adding non-chord tones, it's all about experimenting to find what works best in a song. And that's true of many of the concepts that we discuss on this channel. And as always, if you find this content helpful, remember to like and subscribe. So happy celloing, and I'll see you soon.